This is on display in the Museum of London. I'll put MOL at the bottom right-hand corner. That stands for Museum of London, where it is. The cupboard's empty, to our sorrow, but hope it will be full tomorrow. You know, the food is awful and there's not very much of it. It's from the well-closed debtors' prison, this particular wall, Winwood, dated around 1750. Well close is near Spitalfields, I think, or part of Spitalfields. But this was obviously scratched in there, I presume, by one prisoner. Again, I assume with a nail. And obviously when the prison was demolished, it must have been quite a small prison, I think. They obviously decided that this particular graffiti was worth keeping. It's now in the Museum of London. The cupboard's empty, to our sorrow, but hope it will be full tomorrow. Well, not much hope, I'm afraid. Maybe for debt, it's not so bad. You might have a chance of getting out. Well, it's not the worst crime in the world, but it's all very well unless you're being owed the money in the first place. That's the trouble. I worked for the Ilford County Court and I wrote out warrants to pick up and arrest people that hadn't actually paid their debts a long time ago. But we now move up a notch. We come to the Gordon riots of 1780. Just a couple of pictures to show you. This is mostly chronological. This is the attack and burning of Newgate, and you can see that its furniture is being thrown on the fire. It was anti-Catholic feeling stirred up by Lord George Gordon, who was head of the Protestant Association, and everything just got out of control from the 2nd to the 9th of June 1780 for a week. The worst rioting that London has ever seen. I was around and working in the National Gallery in Trafalgar Square when the poll tax riots were on, and that was pretty bad, but even this was much worse. Finally, the army were let loose in London, as I'm sure many of you know, and at least 285 men and probably some women were killed as they restored order. On Newgate's walls, when they got back into the prison, the army, was scrawled the words, "Inmates freed on authority of His Majesty King Mob." Many of the criminals and many of the men and women inside were never recaptured. And 450 rioters were arrested. There must have been far more on the streets than that. And at least 20 to 30 of them were executed. I mean, in a way, that's almost a small number. In a way, when the army was brought out, people began to think, well, maybe there should be an unarmed police on the streets, as there was in France, funnily enough, in Paris. But that took another, 30, 40 years, 1829, nearer 50 years. But the worst riots ever seen in London. And Newgate, well, I don't know if it was actually burnt to the ground, but it was certainly very badly burnt and damaged. So that was 1780, and so it was rebuilt. Newgate Prison reopened in 1782. We're looking down Old Bailey. If you know that, I mean, I can bring the map back, but we're looking down Old Bailey, which is virtually a hill. And this is 1799. This is George Dance's design from 1770-78, before the Newgate riots, and it had to be rebuilt almost again, but this time they've made it even stronger than before. It's actually the 5th jail on the site at Old Bailey, and the massive forbidding exterior of Newgate has been disguised by soft pastel colours. Lord George Gordon, he got off with a pardon for stirring up all that trouble. He got off very lightly. It's quite amazing. I'll show you him a bit later. But the massive forbidding, I mean, this is based on some of the Renaissance buildings in Italy, where the stonework is very austere. I mean, I could have used the word austere. There's no real decoration. It's almost a blank frontage along here, along Old Bailey, or going down Old Bailey, actually. I think the church down there is one on Ludgate Hill. There's a church on Ludgate Hill. I think it's St Paul's without Ludgate, something like that. I think that's the church on Ludgate Hill down there. I've walked up and down Old Bailey a number of times. So this is George Dance's, original design, burnt down, or part of it was burnt down and rebuilt after the Gordon riots. Mary Wade, we don't have a picture of Mary Wade. This is Bridewell Prison nearby. Mary Wade was 13 and she was stuck first in Bridewell Prison and then Newgate for over 3 months, basically, in 1789. She and another girl stole some clothes. I don't know how good the clothes were, but for stealing a few clothes, she was sentenced to death. But she was very lucky. George III had recovered from a period of madness. And in celebration, all the death sentences were commuted to transportation to Australia. She was the first woman sent there. She later married. I think she actually married twice. And she had something like 300 descendants. And even now in Australia, in New South Wales, there is a remand centre named after her. She was incredibly lucky not to be executed. And on the right there, of course, I put one of Hogarth's famous, illustrations, caricatures of the bench from 1758. Justice and the law was almost merciless. In the past years, past centuries, you could hang for stealing a few clothes, a few pence, and of course, a sheep or a lamb. Judges had great power, but little sympathy for the poor. Trials were short, literally only minutes on certain occasions. Accused were rarely heard from, and lawyers, very few prisoners had lawyers speak for them. It was almost unknown, particularly if, many people just couldn't afford a lawyer, or a solicitor, or a barrister. Death sentences, I mean, Mary Wade was lucky, but generally there was no appeal to a death sentence. The way of appeal did not exist until right at the end of the 19th century. And the only way you could get a sentence commuted was to actually petition the king. A group would literally get people to sign a petition asking for clemency, asking for mercy. Often the petition wasn't even shown to the king or queen. And juries' requests for clemency were often refused or ignored by the judge, or of course the king or the queen. It had to be put before the king or queen to be signed off as for clemency, basically, to commute the sentence. Hogarth, of course, as I'm sure many of you know, was he had quite a number of goes at the law, basically, but he wasn't the only one. I don't have a decent picture of Bridewell, unfortunately. This is supposed to be the receiving room. It looks very nice and clean and airy and light there on the left. Whether it really was as good as that, I have my doubts. But this is by Rowlandson, and he's a very good artist, was Rowlandson. So I've decided to keep the picture in. Every time I looked at the picture in the past few weeks, I almost took it out. But I thought, as she was there in Bridewell, Mary Wade, if she was around, might recognise it. But again, we don't know. Garnish. Garnish had to be paid. It was called garnish. It had to be paid to jailers to obtain and gain extra food, bedding, clothing, beer, whatever. Bribery and corruption were rife. Doctors often refused or delayed or partly refused attending to sick prisoners because the jail was overcrowded with Newgate and disease spread quickly. And probably just as bad for everybody. It was always depressing there because there were prisoners awaiting execution. On the right, so this was one of the pictures that I used on the title slide. How real that is, I don't know. I'm not sure. Prisoners, people passing by the jail held their noses passing by in summer because the stench from the prison could be smelled outside. There were cells were very small, they were cramped, there was a constant lack of fresh air, fresh water and light. Windows, of course, were very small and barred. Bit of a grim place, even at the best of times. Execution outside Old Bailey's debtor's door. Why it was outside the debtor's door? It may be one of the main doors of exit, I suppose. This is around 1809, this particular illustration and drawing, but public executions inside, well, executions inside and outside here for the public began in 1783 and didn't quite last 100 years, as you can see. From 1783 to 1868, witnessed, of course, down the Old Bailey by thousands of them. We're in the old, standing around the Old Bailey here, watching 3 people being hung at the same time, presumably. I don't know if they've climbed up the ladder or not. I mean, the ladder is, unless they're going to bring the body down the ladder, perhaps that's it. I'm still not quite sure about that. Maybe they'll bring the body down that way. I don't know, many people would have turned up, had a good time, others wouldn't. It's very difficult to know now, but this is around 1805 in Old Bailey. 2 more famous men. I could have put in dozens of them, but I've been very selective. Top left is Daniel Defoe, and I think it's his quote, "That horrid place, an emblem of hell itself." A famous novelist, as I'm sure many of you know, had kept a diary as well. He ran a brick and tile factory in Tilbury. In 1703, he spent 3 days in the pillory in Fleet Street, which is why I put down the illustration on the bottom there. And in the pillory, in the stocks, people could throw anything they wanted at you. It would normally be rotten fruit, rotten veg. But at him, the crowd actually threw money. People liked him. He spent time there and in the debtor's jail as well. It's a quotation from somebody else. I don't really know who wrote this, but no man in England but Defoe ever stood in the pillory and later rose to eminence amongst his fellow men. After 3 days in that pillory, he was transferred to Newgate, but he was soon released by the Tory government, who paid off some of his large debts because they wanted him to work for them and even spy for them on the opposition, the Whigs. Visiting a friend in Newgate in 1721, he met Moll King, and Moll King was the inspiration for Moll Flanders. We pretty much spent a lot of time in workhouses and prisons, etc. And that's one of his most famous books from 1722, Moll Flanders. And on the bottom right, of course, is one of my favourites again, William Cobbett. A continual thorn in the Tory government's side, which he was. He wanted reform. He wanted rotten boroughs, which I can explain later if you want, but rotten boroughs it got rid of. He refused to buy votes, give people drinks and pay them cash to vote for them. And he wanted to increase wages, which is always an interesting thing to do with the Tory government, the Conservative government, let's say. So in the end, the Tory government had enough of him. They found him guilty of treason, stirring up trouble, and they jailed him for 2 years in Newgate. On his release, 600 attended his celebration dinner. And in 1832, as it says there, the Great Reform Act was passed and he was voted in as an MP. But sadly, he died in 1835, but he actually made it as an MP. So from being guilty of treason, being stuck in Newgate for, well, 1810, 1812, he became an MP in his own right. Two men, Daniel Defoe and William Cobbett. And again, the Angel of Prisons, Elizabeth Fry. I could have written a lot about Elizabeth Fry. When I began to work out what I was going to say about people, I had virtually 2 or 3 pages, but I've cut it down to this little paragraph. She was a Quaker. She was concerned with women prisoners, their conditions, their food, their bedding, their clothes in the prison, and their children that were there as well. And she funded a school for the prisoners, for the children of prisoners in Newgate. She was horrified by the conditions she saw on her first visit in 1813. She helped and she worked to get death sentences reduced to transportation to Australia and their better travel to the prison ships. They were often taken in open carts to the prison ships that were going to go to Australia, and people would throw insults and hurl insults at them, even hurl, as I say, rotten cabbages, rotten fruit and veg at them, even stones. And so they would be transported to the prison ships in closed carriages. And when she also found out that they weren't being cared for or looked after, or their welfare wasn't attended to at all in Botany Bay. And so she wrote to people there to at least look after them when they arrived there. I put in the picture of her pass on the bottom left and her key. Admit the bearer to the female side of Newgate at 10:30. I assume that's 10:30 in the morning. Prison reforms, as I'm sure you can imagine, were and are very slow. The Fry family, Quaker family, chocolate making, also in terms of banking, very famous family in its own right. And she was known as the Angel of Prisons. She deserved that. She was on the £10 note. When they put faces of famous people on currency, her picture went on a £10 note. I don't think it's used now, but around 2010 it was. And the picture that I used there on the bottom right, it comes out like this. I've not seen the original. I think it's by Jerry Barrett, who's a quite famous artist, certainly based on his work. Elizabeth reads to prisoners in Newgate, and I think it's probably the Bible. That would be reasonable. It all looks very clean and very neat and very tidy, to appeal, of course, to an audience to try and get donations to give to women prisoners, at least make the conditions better. Very few people would give money to prisoners, but at least if you give it to Elizabeth Fry, it may be used for a good cause. Rehabilitation was not really on the agenda for prisoners, unfortunately. Elizabeth Fry. A whipping block and irons. They were used since medieval times. Jack Sheppard himself was whipped and held in irons. And I know of at least one 9-year-old boy who was in prison in Chelmsford jail, who was whipped. Elizabeth Fry abolished their use on women in 1817, so even women were being whipped on various occasions. So that was actually abolished. I'm not sure where this is. It must be on display somewhere, but I haven't actually seen it. There may be one, maybe the Tower of London. I've seen one, I think. And this is how it was used. The prisoner who's being whipped here on the right-hand side. Quite nasty. The Cato Street conspiracy of 1820 is very famous. The captions start on the left. This is the Bow Street runners storming the loft in Bow Street, where they were plotting to assassinate the British cabinet. Unfortunately for them, there was an informer, a spy, planted amongst them, and he gave the information, and the place was raided. Look, I presume this is Arthur Thistlewood right in the centre, stabbing Robert Smithers with his sword here. Stabbed him through the chest, and he died from his injuries. This particular illustration and cartoon is by George Cruikshank. And on the right, we have the executions themselves. 5 were sentenced to death and executed. 5 were transported. Now, Thistlewood was hung, drawn and quartered and beheaded. I think he's the last man to be beheaded in England. Now, on my original caption, I had all 5 were beheaded, but I'm not sure about that. But Thistlewood probably was outside Newgate. And of course, all bodies of criminals went for dissection. Jack Shepherd was one of the lucky ones. His body was quickly got away by his friends, and he was buried at St. Martin's in the Fields Church. But here is the hangman, the executioner, is holding the head of Arthur Thistlewood. Again, quite nasty, 1820. But all in Newgate. I wish this painting was on display more often. I've hardly ever seen it. This is and it has a terrible title. The Upper Condemned Cell in Newgate Prison on the morning of the execution of Henry Fauntleroy in 1824. He's the last man to hang for forgery. There was a crowd of something like 100,000 turned up to witness it. The executioner, don't know much about him, was James Botting, and he was not liked. He was unpopular, was the executioner. It may be that he kept botching executions, but it still cost 1 guinea an execution. That was his fee. And there are 3 men going to be executed. This is Henry Fauntleroy here. He was an owner or part owner manager of a bank. It was going bust, and he needed the money to keep the bank afloat. But he began to forge banknotes. This is Fauntleroy here. There is another prisoner here. I hope you can see my cursor. The man is knocking the shackles off his legs so he can walk to the scaffold, to the gallows. And this is another man sitting here on the far right. Again, his hands are also bound, probably in prayer as well. These are some of his friends at the back here who knew him well, Henry Fauntleroy. And when I was doing some research for this particular talk, I have the catalogue of the Museum of London. This is a Museum of London painting. And there's supposed to be another etching in the Guildhall Library, which I've not seen. And it's only signed W.T., but no one knows if W.T. is William Thompson, and no one knows much about William Thompson anyway, but it's possible that in 1828, even in 1824, William Thompson was a prisoner there, and so maybe he knew Henry Fauntleroy. It's not clear, but it's a very sad painting of 3 executions of 3 men that are going to take place. So not a bad painting, rather a sad one, as I'm sure you can understand. Some of his friends here. Charles Dickens' Newgate, his imagination. I talk about Charles Dickens quite a lot. It's one of my favourite topics. Fagin, in the middle of the 3 pictures, fearfully awaits his execution in the execution cell. Dickens worked with Bob Fagin. Bob Fagin, of course, was a real person. And Dickens himself witnessed almost 30 executions. So did Thackeray as well. He also witnessed lots of executions. And like Hogarth, Dickens always had an interest in prisons and the law, because his father was in the Marshalsea prison for debt in 1824, and the shame affected him all his life. So on the left, I put the painting by Lawrence of Dickens, Fagin, the character, in the middle, and the real Fagin, possibly based on Isaac Solomon. Thackeray used his nickname as a pen name, believe it or not, and his pen name was Ikey. His nickname was Ikey Solomon. So Dickens worked with Bob Fagin in the blacking factory, and Ikey Solomon was also a real person. Everything told of life and animation, she's talking about Newgate, but one large dark cluster of objects in the centre of all, the black stage, the crossbeam, the rope, and all the hideous apparatus of death, where the executions take place. That is in Oliver Twist in 1836.